The silence inside the bomber is broken only by the wind screaming through hundreds of holes in the aluminium skin. The tail gunner is dead, slumped in his position. The ball turret is jammed, the gunner trapped inside. The number 3 engine is gone, torn away completely, leaving a gaping hole where it once was. The right wing looks like Swiss cheese, so many holes punched through it that you wonder how it still provides any lift at all. Hydraulic fluid sprays across the flight deck, mixing with blood from the wounded navigator. The co-pilot is unconscious, hit by shrapnel. The pilot, barely 23 years old, holds the controls with both hands, feeling the aircraft shake and shudder as it struggles to stay in the air. Every instrument on the panel is either shot out or giving impossible readings. They are still 200 miles from England, over German-occupied territory, losing altitude, and there are still German fighters circling, looking for an opportunity to finish them off. This was not an unusual day for a B-17 Flying Fortress crew in World War II. This was just another mission over Nazi Germany, where young American airmen faced some of the most intense combat conditions ever experienced, and where the bomber they flew, the B-17, proved itself capable of absorbing damage that should have torn it from the sky, but somehow, impossibly, kept flying. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was conceived in the 1930s, in a time when the United States Army Air Corps was thinking about how to defend the American coastline from potential enemy fleets. The military wanted a bomber that could fly far out over the ocean, locate enemy warships, and bomb them before they could reach American shores. This required an aircraft with long range, the ability to carry a significant bomb load, and the capability to defend itself because it would be operating far from friendly fighter cover. Boeing's design team, led by a group of talented aeronautical engineers, created an aircraft that would become one of the most iconic bombers in history. The first prototype, the Model 299, flew in July 1935. It was immediately impressive. The aircraft had 4 engines, which was unusual for bombers of that era when most had only 2. It was large, with a wingspan of over 103 feet and a length of 74 feet. It could carry a substantial bomb load and fly at altitudes and speeds that were impressive for the time. But what really caught people's attention was the defensive armament. The prototype bristled with machine guns, multiple gun positions that could theoretically defend the aircraft from attack from any direction. A reporter, seeing the aircraft for the first time with all those gun barrels protruding from it, called it a flying fortress, and the name stuck. The Army Air Corps was interested but cautious. The prototype crashed during evaluation due to pilot error, which set back the program. However, the Air Corps recognized the potential of the design and ordered a small number of pre-production aircraft for further testing. Over the next several years, Boeing refined the design, working out problems and improving performance. By the time the United States entered World War II in December 1941, the B-17 was in production, and the Air Corps, now redesignated as the Army Air Forces, was beginning to build up its bomber force. The B-17 that would see combat in large numbers was designated the B-17E and later the B-17F and B-17G. These models incorporated numerous improvements over the early versions. The B-17E added a tail gun position, eliminating a blind spot that German fighters had learned to exploit. It had improved armor protection for the crew and self-sealing fuel tanks that would not leak or catch fire as easily when punctured by bullets or shrapnel. The engines were more powerful, giving better performance. By the B-17G model, which became the most numerous variant with over 8,000 produced, the aircraft had a maximum defensive armament of 13.50 caliber machine guns, covering virtually every approach angle. The structure of the B-17 was what made it so remarkably durable. Boeing engineers had designed the aircraft with a philosophy of redundancy and robustness. The fuselage was a semi-monocoque structure, meaning the aluminium skin itself carried some of the structural loads, but there was also an internal framework of stringers and formers that provided strength. This meant that the aircraft could sustain significant damage to the skin without the entire structure collapsing. Holes could be punched through the fuselage, and as long as the main structural members remained intact, the aircraft would hold together. The wings were similarly designed with multiple spars, the main structural members that ran spanwise through the wing. If one spar was damaged, the others could carry the load. The wing also had numerous ribs, which maintained the airfoil shape and distributed loads. The control surfaces, the ailerons, elevators, and rudder were connected through cables that ran through the aircraft. These cables had some redundancy as well, and even if some were cut by damage, the pilot might still retain partial control. The four engines were Wright R1820 Cyclone radial engines, each producing about 1,200 horsepower. Radial engines, with their cylinders arranged in a circle around the crankshaft, were inherently tough. They could continue running even with significant damage because the cylinders were separate, and damage to one cylinder did not necessarily affect the others. The B-17 could fly on 3 engines or even on 2 engines in some circumstances, though with reduced performance and altitude capability. This redundancy in power was crucial for survival because engines were frequently damaged by enemy fire. The fuel system was designed with self-sealing tanks. These tanks had multiple layers, including a layer of rubber that would swell when exposed to fuel. If a bullet punctured the tank, the fuel leaking out would cause the rubber layer to expand, sealing the hole. This did not make the tanks invulnerable, but it greatly reduced the chance of catastrophic fuel loss or fire. A B-17 could take multiple hits to its fuel tanks and still have enough fuel to make it home. The crew of a B-17 typically consisted of 10 men. There was the pilot, who was the aircraft commander, responsible for the entire aircraft and crew. The co-pilot sat next to him, assisting with flying duties and serving as backup in case the pilot was incapacitated. The navigator, usually located in the nose of the aircraft, was responsible for determining the aircraft's position and plotting the course to the target and back. The bombardier, also in the nose, was responsible for aiming and releasing the bombs. The flight engineer, who also served as the top turret gunner, monitored the aircraft systems and engines. The radio operator handled communications and also manned a machine gun. The ball turret gunner operated the spherical turret mounted on the belly of the aircraft, one of the most vulnerable and claustrophobic positions. The 2 waist gunners manned machine guns on either side of the rear fuselage. The tail gunner, in the very back of the aircraft, covered the rear approach, which was a favorite attack angle for German fighters. These men, most of them barely out of their teens or in their early 20s, faced conditions in combat that are difficult for us to imagine today. They flew at altitudes of 25,000 feet or higher, where the temperature could be 40 or 50 degrees below zero. The aircraft was not pressurized, so they breathed oxygen through masks. The noise was incredible, the roar of 4 engines and the slipstream of air rushing past the aircraft at 180 miles per hour. When under attack, the noise was even worse, with machine guns firing, shells exploding, and the aircraft shaking and bucking as the pilot maneuvered to evade fighters. The 8th Air Force, based in England, began flying bombing missions over occupied Europe in 1942. The initial raids were small and targeted relatively easy objectives, but the strategic bombing campaign quickly escalated. American doctrine called for daylight precision bombing, the idea being that bombers flying in daylight could use the Norden bomb sight to accurately hit specific industrial targets. This was in contrast to the British, who had switched to night bombing after suffering heavy losses in daylight raids. The Americans believed that their bombers, particularly the B-17 with its heavy defensive armament, could fight their way to the target and back without fighter escort. This belief was tested in the crucible of combat over Germany, and the results were devastating. German fighter pilots, flying Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s, developed tactics specifically designed to attack bomber formations. They would attack from the front, where the early B-17s had limited defensive firepower, closing at a combined speed of over 500 miles per hour and firing their cannons and machine guns into the bomber formation. They would also attack from below and above, trying to find blind spots in the defensive coverage. German pilots became skilled at judging deflection angles and lead, aiming where the bomber would be when their shells arrived. The ammunition the German fighters used was particularly deadly. Their cannons, typically 20 or even 30, fired explosive shells that would detonate on impact. A direct hit from one of these shells could blow a large hole in the aircraft, destroy an engine, or kill crew members. Even near misses could cause damage from shrapnel. The German fighters also carried armor-piercing incendiary ammunition that could penetrate the bomber's armor and set fuel tanks on fire despite the self-sealing features. In addition to fighters, the bombers faced intense anti-aircraft fire called flak. German anti-aircraft batteries, equipped with radar-directed guns, would fill the sky with exploding shells when bomber formations approached. The shells were fused to explode at specific altitudes, creating clouds of shrapnel. A bomber formation flying through a flak barrage looked like it was flying through a forest of black smoke puffs, each representing an exploding shell. The fragments from these shells could shred aluminium skin, cut control cables, damage engines, and kill or wound crew members. The losses were staggering. On some missions, 10% or more of the attacking force would fail to return. A crew had to fly 25 missions to complete a combat tour, and statistically, the odds of surviving 25 missions in 1943 were not good. Crews watched their friends take off in the morning and not come back. They saw bombers blown apart in midair or spiral down trailing fire and smoke. They saw parachutes, too few of them, and knew that most of the crew had gone down with the aircraft. This created enormous psychological stress on top of the physical dangers of combat. Yet despite the losses and the terrible conditions, the B-17s kept flying, and some of them survived damage that seems impossible. There are numerous documented cases of B-17s returning to base with damage so extensive that ground crews could not believe the aircraft had flown at all. let alone made it hundreds of miles back across enemy territory. One of the most famous cases was a B-17F named All-American. In February 1943, this aircraft was in formation over Tunisia during a bombing mission when a German Bf-109 fighter collided with it. The fighter struck the B-17 just behind the cockpit, nearly cutting the fuselage in half. The rear portion of the aircraft, from just behind the wings to the tail, was separated from the front except for a few structural members and some control cables. The tail section was twisted at an angle to the front section. By all logic, the aircraft should have broken apart immediately. The aerodynamic loads should have torn the weakened structure apart, sending both halves tumbling to earth. But somehow, impossibly, it held together. The pilot, Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, maintained control. The aircraft was barely controllable, responding sluggishly to control inputs, but it responded. Bragg kept the aircraft as steady as possible while the crew in the rear section, who had survived the collision, worked their way forward through the damaged aircraft to reach the part where parachutes were stored. One by one, most of the rear crew bilayed out over Allied territory. The tail gunner and the waist gunners successfully parachuted, but 2 crew members remained in the tail section, either unable or choosing not to bail out. Bragg decided to try to fly the aircraft back to base. For over an hour, he nursed the crippled bomber through the sky, maintaining altitude and airspeed carefully because any wrong move could cause the aircraft to break apart. The crew remaining in the front section watched through the gaping hole behind them as the tail section twisted and moved, held on by just a few structural members. Finally, Bragg brought the aircraft in for a landing. He touched down as gently as possible, and incredibly, the aircraft held together through the landing roll. When ground crews examined the aircraft, they found that it was held together by just 2 structural members along the bottom of the fuselage and some control cables. Photographs of All-American showing the massive damage became famous visual proof of just how tough the B-17 was. Another remarkable case involved a B-17 that was hit by a bomb dropped from another B-17 flying in formation above it. The bomb smashed through the top of the fuselage, passed through the bomb bay, and exited through the bottom of the aircraft without exploding. The hole it left was enormous, several feet in diameter both on the top and bottom. The aircraft lost pressurization, but the crew was on oxygen anyway. The structure around the bomb bay was severely damaged, but the main wing spars were intact. The pilot was able to maintain control and flew the aircraft back to England, where he landed successfully. Ground crews counted over 400 separate holes in the aircraft from flak and fighter attacks, in addition to the massive damage from the bomb that had passed through it. There are accounts of B-17s returning with entire sections of wing missing. The wing is the primary lifting surface, and damage to it directly affects the aircraft's ability to fly. Yet there are photographs and eyewitness accounts of B-17s that had lost several feet of outer wing, with the wing spar visible where it had been torn away, and yet the aircraft remained controllable. The pilot would have to compensate with aileron and rudder to keep the aircraft flying straight, and performance would be significantly degraded, but the aircraft could still fly. Engines were frequently shot away completely. The B-17 had 4 engines, and German pilots knew that destroying engines would reduce the bomber's ability to maintain altitude and keep up with the formation. A bomber that fell behind the formation was much more vulnerable to follow-up attacks. Yet B-17s regularly made it home on 3 engines, and there are documented cases of B-17s making it home on just 2 engines. Flying on 2 engines meant significantly reduced performance. The aircraft would lose altitude steadily, unable to maintain the 25,000-foot bombing altitude. It would be slower, making it easier for fighters to attack. But the 2 remaining engines, if they were on opposite sides to maintain balance, could provide enough power to keep the aircraft airborne and moving toward friendly territory. The damage to control surfaces was another category of injury that should have been fatal but often was not. The ailerons, which control roll, the elevators, which control pitch, and the rudder, which controls yaw, were all vulnerable to damage. They were relatively thin structures covered with fabric or thin aluminium, and cannon fire or shrapnel could tear large holes in them or even completely destroy portions of them. Yet pilots found that even with substantial damage to control surfaces, they could still control the aircraft. The controls would be heavy, requiring more force to move, and the response would be sluggish, but control was possible. There are accounts of B-17s landing with elevators that were more whole than surface, barely recognizable as aircraft components. Yet the pilot had managed to control pitch well enough to make a landing. The tail section was particularly vulnerable because it was the thinnest part of the aircraft and was exposed to attacks from behind, a favorite German tactic. The tail gunner sat in an isolated position at the very back, alone and often the first to see attacking fighters. His was one of the most dangerous positions in the aircraft, and casualties among tail gunners were high. The tail itself, a thin structure containing the vertical stabilizer and rudder, plus the horizontal stabilizers and elevators, could sustain remarkable damage. There are photographs of B-17s with the vertical stabilizer nearly shot away, with huge holes in the horizontal stabilizers, and yet the aircraft remained controllable enough to return home. One of the factors that contributed to the B-17 survivability was the training and skill of the pilots and crews. Army Air Forces training was rigorous. Pilots went through months of training, learning to fly increasingly complex aircraft, culminating in training on multi-engine bombers. They learned to handle the aircraft in normal conditions and in emergencies. They practiced engine-out procedures, landing with damaged aircraft, and dealing with various system failures. When they arrived at combat squadrons in England, they received additional training specific to combat operations. This training paid off when aircraft were damaged in combat. Pilots knew how to assess the situation, to determine what was still working and what was not, to figure out what they could do with the damaged aircraft. They knew how to compensate for asymmetric thrust when engines on one side were damaged. They knew how to use trim tabs to reduce control forces. They knew when to reduce power to prevent further engine damage, and when to push the engines hard to maintain altitude or speed. These skills, developed through training and refined through experience, made the difference between bringing a damaged bomber home and having it crash. The crews also played a crucial role in survival. The flight engineer monitored the engines and other systems, noticing problems and advising the pilot. If an engine was on fire, he knew the procedures to try to extinguish it. If hydraulic pressure was lost, he knew what systems would be affected and what backup procedures were available. The navigator, even with damaged equipment, would use every method available to determine the aircraft's position and plot a course home. The bombardier might have to assume navigation duties if the navigator was wounded. The radio operator would try to maintain contact with other aircraft in the formation or with bases, providing position updates and calling for help if needed. The gunners, in addition to defending the aircraft, served as lookouts. They would report damage they could see, calling out over the intercom that an engine was on fire or that a wing was damaged. They would report attacking fighters, giving the pilot warning so he could maneuver. They would provide a second set of eyes for the pilot, who was focused on flying the aircraft and might not see everything. In a heavily damaged aircraft, crew members would sometimes move around the aircraft, assessing damage, trying to manually operate jammed systems, or helping wounded crew members. The psychological aspect of surviving in a damaged aircraft cannot be overstated. Imagine you are in a B-17 that has just been attacked. You hear the impacts as cannon shells hit the aircraft. You hear the screaming of the wind through new holes in the fuselage. You might smell smoke or hydraulic fluid or blood. You might see crew members wounded or dead. The aircraft is shaking and difficult to control. You are over enemy territory, still potentially under attack, and you have to maintain your composure and do your job. The fear must have been overwhelming, yet these young men, most of them barely out of high school, did their jobs. They kept fighting, kept flying, kept trying to bring their aircraft home. The bomber formations themselves provided a measure of protection and support. The B-17s would fly in tight formations, called combat boxes, designed to maximize defensive firepower. The idea was that any fighter attacking the formation would be engaged by multiple machine guns from multiple aircraft. This overlapping fire made fighter attacks more dangerous for the German pilots and provided some protection for the bombers. If a bomber in the formation was damaged and falling behind, other bombers would sometimes drop back to escort it, their gunners providing additional defensive fire to protect the straggler. The distances involved were extraordinary. Missions from England to targets deep in Germany might involve round trips of 1,000 miles or more. At 180 miles per hour, that is over 5 hours of flying time, and that does not account for time over the target or for reduced speeds due to damage. A damaged bomber struggling home might be in the air for 7 or 8 hours, with the crew knowing that every minute they were over enemy territory, they could be attacked again. The psychological strain of flying for hours in a damaged, barely controllable aircraft, wondering if it would hold together, wondering if German fighters would return, must have been incredible. There were cases where the damage was too severe and crews had to abandon the aircraft. The procedure for bailing out was practiced in training but was terrifying in reality. The crew would have to leave their positions, make their way to exits, and jump out into the slipstream at 25,000 feet. The temperature outside was below zero. The air was thin enough that you could lose consciousness quickly without oxygen. The parachute had to open properly, a main chute, and a reserve if the main failed. Then you drifted down, hoping you would land in friendly or neutral territory rather than in Germany, where you would be captured. Many crew members who bailated out over Germany spent the rest of the war in prisoner of war camps. The ones who tried to bring damaged aircraft home did so knowing the risks. The aircraft could break apart in flight. It could catch fire and explode. It could crash on landing, especially with damaged landing gear or flight controls. Yet they tried because the alternative was bailing out, and pilots felt a responsibility to try to save their aircraft and bring their crew home safely. Many did not make it. Some aircraft broke apart in flight, despite the crew's best efforts. Some crashed short of the airfield, running out of altitude or having an engine failure at a critical moment. Some crashed on landing, the damaged structure finally giving way when the aircraft hit the ground. But the ones that made it, the bombers that struggled home with damage that should have killed them, those became legendary. Ground crews would gather around returned aircraft, counting holes, shaking their heads in disbelief at the damage. They would photograph the aircraft, documenting the damage for intelligence purposes and for training. These photographs show the incredible abuse that B-17s absorbed. You see wings with hundreds of holes, fuselages looking like they went through a shredder, engines completely torn away, tail surfaces reduced to bare frameworks. One crew chief reportedly counted over 1,000 holes in a single returned B-17. Some aircraft had so many holes that counting them individually was almost impossible, so estimates were made. There are accounts of aircraft with literally thousands of holes from shrapnel and machine gun fire. Each hole represented a piece of metal that had torn through the aluminium skin. Collectively, they represented an incredible amount of damage, yet the aircraft had continued to fly. The maintenance crews who repaired these aircraft deserve recognition as well. They worked long hours in all weather, often in the cold English winter, patching holes, replacing damaged parts, repairing systems, and getting aircraft back into flyable condition. Some damage was so extensive that the aircraft were declared beyond economical repair and were either scrapped or cannibalized for parts. But many heavily damaged aircraft were repaired and flew again, sometimes taking more damage on subsequent missions and being repaired again. The production of B-17s was a massive industrial undertaking. Boeing produced the majority, but Douglas and Lockheed also built B-17s under license. At peak production, B-17s were being completed at a rate of several per day. Over 12,000 B-17s were built during the war, a testament to American industrial capacity. This production was necessary because losses were high. In 1943, before long-range fighter escorts were available, the 8th Air Force was losing aircraft at an unsustainable rate. Some missions saw losses of 20% or more. The introduction of long-range fighter escorts, particularly the P-51 Mustang, which could accompany the bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany and back, dramatically reduced bomber losses. With friendly fighters to engage the German interceptors, the bombers faced less intense fighter attacks, and losses decreased significantly. However, even with fighter escort, losses continued. Flak remained a deadly threat throughout the war, and German fighter pilots, though increasingly outnumbered, remained skilled and dangerous. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany is still debated by historians. Did it shorten the war? Was it worth the cost in aircrew casualties? Could the resources devoted to building thousands of bombers and training tens of thousands of airmen have been better used elsewhere? These are complex questions without simple answers. What is clear is that the American airmen who flew the B-17s paid a heavy price. The 8th Air Force alone suffered over 47,000 casualties, including over 26,000 killed in action. The average age of these casualties was about 24 years old. For the B-17 crews who survived their tour, the experience marked them for life. Many suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though at the time it was not well understood or treated. They had recurring nightmares about being trapped in burning aircraft. They could not stand loud noises or feeling confined. They felt guilt about surviving when so many friends had not. Yet many of them also felt pride in what they had accomplished, in the missions they had flown, in the courage they had shown, in the bonds they had formed with their crew members. The B-17 itself became a symbol of American air power and industrial might. The sight of hundreds of B-17s forming up over England and then heading toward Germany was an impressive display of power. The trails of condensation from their engines would crisscross the sky. The sound of over 1,000 radial engines was a constant roar. German civilians on the ground would watch these formations pass overhead, knowing that destruction was coming to German cities and factories. The Germans developed numerous tactics and weapons to combat the B-17 formations. In addition to conventional fighter attacks, they tried using bombers carrying large bombs to drop on the formations from above, hoping to break up the formation or destroy multiple bombers with a single large explosion. They developed rocket-armed fighters that would fire salvos of rockets into the formation from outside the range of the defensive machine guns. They even experimented with ramming attacks, where pilots would deliberately collide with bombers, hoping to destroy the bomber while the pilot bailated out. Some of these tactics were more effective than others, but all of them reflected the serious threat that the bombing campaign posed to Germany. The bomber crews developed their own tactics and survival techniques. They learned to watch for certain types of fighter attacks and to call them out early. They learned to recognize which German fighters were the most dangerous and to concentrate fire on them. They learned that holding formation, no matter how intense the attacks, gave them the best chance of survival. Breaking formation and trying to run for home individually almost always ended badly because a lone bomber was easy prey for fighters. They also learned that luck played a role. A shell might pass through the aircraft without hitting anything critical, or it might detonate an oxygen bottle and start a catastrophic fire. A fighter attack might rake the entire length of the bomber, or it might miss completely. You could do everything right and still be shot down, or you could make mistakes and still survive. This randomness, this knowledge that survival was not entirely in your control, added to the psychological burden. The B-17 gained a reputation among crews for being able to take punishment and bring them home. This reputation was not just propaganda or wishful thinking. It was based on real experience, on missions where aircraft with catastrophic damage somehow kept flying. Crews trusted the B-17, and that trust was important. When your aircraft was damaged and you were over enemy territory, you needed to believe that your bomber could make it home. That belief helped crews maintain their composure and do what needed to be done. There were, of course, other bombers in the war. The B-24 Liberator was produced in greater numbers than the B-17 and had some performance advantages. However, B-24 crews often felt that their aircraft was not as sturdy as the B-17. The B-24 had a high-mounted Davis wing that was very efficient aerodynamically, giving it better range and higher speed than the B-17 at similar weights. However, this wing was built with a thin cross-section to reduce drag, and it had a reputation for being vulnerable to damage. Fuel tanks in the wing could explode if hit, and structural damage to the wing could cause catastrophic failure. B-24 crews did not have the same confidence in their aircraft's ability to absorb damage that B-17 crews had. British bombers like the Lancaster and Halifax were designed for night bombing and had different characteristics. They typically carried larger bomb loads but had less defensive armament because they relied on darkness for protection rather than defensive guns. They suffered heavy losses as well, though in different circumstances than the American daylight bombers. The B continued to evolve throughout the war. Later models had improved turrets with better fields of fire. The chin turret, added to the B-17G, provided forward-firing capability that helped counter head-on attacks, which had been a German tactic specifically developed to exploit the weak forward armament of earlier B-17 models. Other improvements included better oxygen systems, improved armor protection, upgraded engines, and various minor modifications based on combat experience. After the war, the B-17 continued in service for a while in various roles, including air-sea rescue and weather reconnaissance. However, it was soon superseded by more modern aircraft. Many B-17s were scrapped, their aluminium melted down. Some were sold as surplus and converted for civilian use. A few were preserved in museums, where they remain today as reminders of the air war over Europe. The story of the B-17 Flying Fortress is ultimately a story about the young men who flew and maintained them, who faced terrifying conditions day after day, who watched friends die, who persevered despite losses that would have broken many units. The toughness of the aircraft made their survival possible, but it was their courage, their training, their skill, and their determination that made the difference between completing the mission or not, between making it home or not. When we look at photographs of heavily damaged B-17s, with their Swiss cheese wings and shot-away engines, with their battered fuselages and shattered tail sections, we are seeing physical evidence of the intensity of the air war over Europe. Each hole represents a moment when death or catastrophic failure was possible. Each damaged aircraft that made it home represents the triumph of engineering, skill, and sheer determination over the destructive forces arrayed against it. The exact number of holes in any specific aircraft is difficult to verify with certainty, as counting small holes was not always a priority, and damage reports varied in their detail. Some aircraft had hundreds of documented holes, others had thousands. Whether a specific aircraft had exactly 11,000 holes is less important than the broader truth that B-17s routinely absorbed levels of damage that seemed impossible to survive, yet continued to fly and bring their crews home. These bombers and their crews wrote a remarkable chapter in aviation history and in the history of World War II. They demonstrated that well-designed aircraft, flown by trained and determined crews, could accomplish missions under the most adverse conditions imaginable. They showed that the combination of American industrial capacity, engineering excellence, and the courage of young airmen could project power deep into enemy territory despite heavy opposition. The B-17 Flying Fortress earned its reputation not through propaganda, but through the thousands of missions where it proved its worth, where it protected its crew, where it absorbed punishment that should have destroyed it, and where it brought those crews home. That is the real story of the B-17, and it remains one of the most compelling stories of courage and survival from World War II.